In the autumn of 1960, America stood at a crossroads. The nation was locked in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. Nuclear weapons were pointed across oceans. Fear, hope, and uncertainty hung thick in the air. And at the center of it all stood two men fighting for the most powerful office on earth. On one side, Vice President Richard Nixon, a seasoned political veteran. On the other, Senator John F. Kennedy, young, charismatic, Catholic, and controversial. The race between them would become one of the closest elections in American history. But behind the campaign speeches, televised debates, and patriotic slogans, whispers spread through backrooms and alleyways. Whispers of deals, of favors, of alliances that were never supposed to exist, and at the center of those whispers, the Mafia. For decades, organized crime had operated as a shadow government in many American cities. From New York to Las Vegas to Chicago, mob bosses controlled gambling, unions, construction, transportation, and political influence. They didn't run for office. They didn't appear on ballots, but they had something just as powerful. Votes. Chicago, Illinois. A city notorious for political corruption, machine politics, and mob control. Run for decades by Mayor Richard J. Daley, a man who commanded an unmatched political apparatus capable of mobilizing tens of thousands of votes with military precision. Daley publicly presented himself as a loyal Democrat, a champion of working-class families. Privately, many believed he had long-standing relationships with organized crime figures who ruled Chicago's underworld. Men like Sam Giancana, Johnny Rosselli, Tony Accardo. These weren't small-time criminals. They were national power brokers in the American Mafia. By 1960, organized crime faced an existential threat. The federal government had begun turning its attention toward dismantling the mob. Senate hearings, wiretaps, and new laws threatened decades of untouchable power. The Mafia needed protection. They needed influence. They needed someone in the White House who would look the other way. John F. Kennedy's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, was no stranger to controversial alliances. During Prohibition, rumors swirled that Joe Kennedy made a fortune through bootlegging. While never proven in court, the allegations followed him for the rest of his life. More importantly, Joe Kennedy understood power. He knew elections were not always won by speeches alone. They were won by organization, money, and sometimes by people willing to do illegal things to guarantee victory. As JFK's campaign struggled in key swing states, Illinois emerged as one of the most critical battlegrounds. Whoever won Illinois would almost certainly win the presidency. And Chicago controlled Illinois. Richard Daley controlled Chicago, and many believed Sam Giancana controlled Richard Daley. Giancana, flamboyant, violent, and ruthless, had risen to become boss of the Chicago outfit. He loved power, he loved money, and he loved influence. According to later testimony and investigative reports, Giancana and other mob figures allegedly offered to deliver Chicago's votes to Kennedy in exchange for future protection from prosecution. No signed contracts, no recorded meetings, only intermediaries, lawyers, fixers, friends of friends. One of those intermediaries, many believe, was Frank Sinatra. The legendary singer was close friends with JFK. He was also deeply connected to Giancana. Sinatra allegedly helped bridge the worlds of Hollywood, politics, and organized crime. A glamorous surface, with a criminal foundation beneath. Election day arrived. November 8, 1960. The nation waited. The results came in slowly, painfully slowly. By midnight, it was clear the race was razor-thin. Then Illinois turned blue. Kennedy won the state by fewer than 9,000 votes. In Chicago alone, he carried huge margins in districts known for corruption, ballot stuffing, and machine politics. Almost immediately, accusations surfaced. Dead people voting. Ballots cast by individuals who never showed up. Precinct totals exceeding registered voters. Republican poll watchers blocked from observing counts. Nixon's team quietly investigated. They found irregularities. They found suspicious patterns, but Nixon made a fateful decision. He refused to challenge the election publicly. He claimed that contesting the results would tear the country apart. Officially, Kennedy became president. Unofficially, a question was born that would never die. Did the Mafia help put JFK in the White House? And if they did, what happened when he turned against them? To understand the allegations surrounding the 1960 election, you must understand Chicago. Chicago politics had long been dominated by what historians call the machine, a tightly controlled system where precinct captains delivered votes in exchange for jobs, favors, housing, and protection. At the top sat Mayor Richard J. Daley. Daley controlled police promotions, city contracts, public housing, union leadership. Nothing happened without his approval, but Daley did not operate alone. For decades, the Chicago outfit had quietly infiltrated labor unions, trucking companies, waste management, and construction. These industries controlled thousands of workers who were expected to vote as instructed. Sam Giancana didn't need to threaten every voter. He only needed to control the people who controlled them. On Election Day 1960, turnout in certain Chicago wards reached extraordinary levels. Some precincts reported participation rates over 90%. In several cases, investigators later found that the number of votes exceeded the number of registered voters. Republican observers reported being physically removed from polling stations. Ballot boxes were allegedly left unattended. Vote tallies were revised hours after polls closed. None of this proved Mafia involvement directly, but it demonstrated a system vulnerable to manipulation, a system the mob had mastered. Journalist Seymour Hersh later reported that FBI wiretaps and informants suggested Giancana boasted privately about delivering Illinois to Kennedy. Former mob associates also claimed the outfit considered the election a successful investment. What did they expect in return? The answer came in the form of JFK's younger brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. RFK despised organized crime. He had built his career investigating mob bosses through Senate hearings. He believed the Mafia represented one of the greatest internal threats to American democracy. Once appointed Attorney General, RFK launched an unprecedented crackdown. Prosecutions against organized crime skyrocketed, wiretaps increased, task forces expanded. Top mob figures found themselves under constant surveillance. Sam Giancana became one of the most targeted men in America. From the mob's perspective, this was betrayal. If they had helped elect JFK, then the Kennedys had stabbed them in the back. Anger grew. So did paranoia. The alliance, real or imagined, had collapsed. Meanwhile, the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had its own complicated role. For years, Hoover publicly downplayed the existence of a national mafia. Privately, he had been collecting intelligence. Some historians believe Hoover possessed compromising information about politicians, mobsters, and even the Kennedys themselves. Information he used as leverage. The 1960 election sat at the center of this tangled web: politics, crime, intelligence agencies, power struggles. The official historical record says JFK won fair and square, but historians acknowledge significant irregularities in Illinois and Texas. Enough irregularities that if Nixon had challenged the results, the outcome might have changed. Why didn't he? Some believe Nixon feared exposing vulnerabilities in America's electoral system. Others believe he was pressured behind the scenes. Or perhaps he believed the presidency wasn't worth tearing the country apart. Regardless of motive, the silence allowed the controversy to fade into the background. But among mob circles, the belief remained strong. They had made a king, and that king had declared war on them, a war that would have consequences, deadly consequences. By 1962, the war between the Kennedy administration and organized crime was in full force. Robert Kennedy increased Mafia prosecutions by more than 800%. Major figures were indicted, Others went into hiding. Some turned informant. Sam Giancana, once untouchable, found himself constantly tailed. Phones tapped, friends arrested, businesses raided. The mob felt hunted. At the same time, the CIA approached Mafia figures with an extraordinary request. They wanted help assassinating Fidel Castro. Why the Mafia? Because Castro had shut down Havana's casinos, destroying lucrative mob operations in Cuba. The CIA believed mobsters had both motive and access. Giancana and Johnny Rosselli allegedly participated in these plots. So here was the paradox. The U.S. government was using mobsters for covert operations, while the Attorney General was prosecuting them relentlessly. To organized crime, this looked like hypocrisy. To Giancana, it looked personal. Some mob informants later claimed that Giancana believed JFK owed him, not just politically, but existentially, and that RFK's crusade represented an unforgivable betrayal. Then came November 22, 1963, Dallas, Texas. John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Within hours, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested. 2 days later, Oswald was murdered by Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner with known mob connections. Immediately, conspiracy theories exploded. One theory suggested that organized crime had a role in JFK's assassination as retaliation for the betrayal. No definitive proof has ever emerged, but the pattern disturbed many investigators. Mafia connections, CIA mafia plots, silenced witnesses, destroyed evidence. Giancana himself would never testify publicly about 1960. In 1975, just days before he was scheduled to appear before a congressional committee, Sam Giancana was shot dead in his home. 7 bullets. Execution style. Most believe he was killed by his own associates. A permanent silencing. Johnny Rosselli, another key figure, later turned up murdered, his body stuffed inside a steel drum and dumped in the ocean. One by one, potential witnesses vanished. The story of the 1960 election became inseparable from a broader narrative of power, secrecy, and death. Not a single document definitively proves the Mafia rigged the election, but the circumstantial evidence is heavy. Chicago's corruption, mob boasts, political machines, unusual voting patterns, silenced figures. What remains is a question that refuses to disappear. Did organized crime help place a president into office? And if so, was that decision the beginning of the end for everyone involved? Mainstream historians generally agree on one thing. The 1960 election was extremely close. They also acknowledge irregularities in Illinois and Texas. Where opinions diverge is intent. Was the fraud systematic or simply localized corruption? Was it decisive, or merely noise in a chaotic system? Some scholars argue that even if Illinois flipped, Kennedy still might have won through other states. Others argue Illinois was decisive. The FBI investigated claims of fraud. No nationwide conspiracy was officially confirmed, but many investigations were limited in scope. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses recanted. Political pressure mounted. J. Edgar Hoover reportedly warned presidents that exposing too much could destabilize public trust in democracy. So silence became policy. The deeper truth may lie somewhere between extremes. Not a grand, omnipotent conspiracy, not pure innocence, but a political culture where bending rules was normal, where alliances with criminals were tolerated, where winning mattered more than integrity. The Mafia thrived in that environment. So did political machines. So did intelligence agencies operating in secrecy. The 1960 election symbolizes that era, an era when power operated in shadows, where moral lines blurred, where alliances were transactional, and where consequences were often fatal. John F. Kennedy became a symbol of hope, Camelot, progress, civil rights. But behind the myth stands a far more complicated story, one where victory may have been assisted by forces that later became enemies, one where idealism and corruption coexisted. History remembers Kennedy as a martyr, but history also whispers another possibility, that his rise to power was not as clean as the legend suggests. More than 60 years later, the question still lingers. Did the Mafia rig the 1960 election? There is no smoking gun, no signed confession, no undisputed document, but there is a pattern of corruption, a pattern of coincidence, a pattern of powerful men benefiting from silence. Perhaps the truth was buried intentionally. Perhaps it was fragmented beyond recovery. Or perhaps it exists in pieces scattered across sealed files, dead witnesses, and forgotten memos. What we do know is this: organized crime had motive, they had means, they had opportunity, and they had a history of manipulating elections at the local level. We also know that once JFK took office, the war against the Mafia intensified, and many of the men who could have clarified the truth died violently. History is often written by survivors, and in this story, very few survived. Maybe the 1960 election was stolen. Maybe it was. But the fact that such a question remains plausible tells us something disturbing about American power structures. It tells us democracy is fragile. It tells us corruption thrives in darkness. And it tells us that sometimes the greatest scandals are not the ones proven in court, but the ones history quietly steps around. Because some secrets are too dangerous to fully expose, and some truths, once revealed, would force a nation to look at itself in a mirror it would rather avoid.